Evolution creates animals capable of surviving the harsh climate changes the Earth endures. Video game developer Will Wright, the idea of a world filled with evolving creatures was the perfect backdrop for his newest game, Spore.
We knew that it would be a real game when we were able to create the first real character, when we were able to basically make something that looked like a professional 3D model character that had a real presence and was textured and moved around. The moment that we first brought a creature to life, in a sense, it was sort of a Dr. Frankenstein moment, you know, when you said it's alive.
One of the challenges of Spore was keeping the player connected to their creature throughout the game.
When you add a part to a creature, it'll sort of realize that you've added this part, and what that does is it brings the creature to life and it gives it emotion, so that, you know, if you pull its arm off and it kind of hangs its head and it's sad, you know, you kind of feel for it, you want to put the arm back on. Or when you put a new mouth on the creature and it sort of tries it out and does a roar, you really can relate to it a lot more. You know, that brings an emotional element to it.
So not only is the player customizing the way their creature looks or the way their spaceship looks, but they're molding their creature's experience by how they play the game. Every choice that they make can have effects in later levels. You know, how you decide to befriend a tribe or conquer a tribe makes an impact on what abilities you'll have in space.
Essentially everything that you can do, so whether the way you fight, the way you socialize, the way you eat, is all defined by the parts that you had. So if you put a carnivorous mouth on, you have to eat meat. You know, if you put a herbivorous mouth on, you have to eat fruit. And I think that's the heart and soul of Creature Game, you know, this idea that I made something and now my game changes because of the way I made my creature. I think that's a much stronger game and a much more interesting thing to build than to just say, I have predefined things I can do and I can make something that looks different.
As we get into like the technology stuff, I had to have some very serious programmers that could go in and solve fundamental problems that had not been solved before. You know, Chris Hecker was brought in to work on the animation system, which probably was the single hardest technical problem we faced in Spore. You know, we did a lot of research finding out what the state of the art in this was, and there was very, very little work in this actually. And I think we've probably advanced the state of the art by several years in, you know, procedural animation.
I think that the easiest way to describe what proceduralism in the sense that Spore means it is we have to teach the computer how to do something. With Spore, the things that we save out onto the DVD that you install on your computer are not these fixed recipes anymore. They're kind of lessons for the computer to learn how to do the thing itself in some very hand-wavy sort of way.
There's a whole pipeline under the hood. You know, in most games you have thousands and thousands of dollars worth of artists' tools. The artists use those tools and they manually get all the content, you know, from the 3D authoring app into the game. There's engineers who are responsible for shepherding that data through at every stage, and you know, it's a big part of making a game. In contrast, in a game like Spore, all that stuff has to take place automatically and on the fly, internally inside the game. We have to be able to build the geography of the world, the terrain, the oceans and the mountain ranges, and we have about half a second to build that world. Then we have to build all the buildings and vehicles. We have to populate the whole world of the creatures. That might take another couple of seconds. So we've got, you know, maybe 8 seconds, maybe 10 seconds to go from nothing to a world with weather and plants and cities and vehicles driving around and creatures living on it. So we've got these tiny little recipes for creating a building. So when the player creates a building, what they're really doing is they're writing a recipe for creating a building. And the recipe gets sent to everyone else who's playing the game. So the player in the background downloads a recipe for a creature, and then we have to reconstitute that recipe as a creature at the level where the player needs to see it in, you know, half a second or a second or so.
In Spore, we're sort of, in some sense, teaching the computer to fish for all of these things. How do you generate a mesh? How do you make an animation across, you know, work across multiple creatures and things like that? The programming becomes sort of this teaching process of the computer as opposed to this telling it how it is.
But, you know, that's something that involves kind of deep, scary voodoo math. It's the kind of thing where you just kind of put, you know, a couple really sharp guys on it and sit back and give them a year and cross your fingers and hope for the best. That could have sunk the whole project had Chris Hecker and his group not been able to kind of crack that nut.
You don't know who your actor is. It might have 8 arms, it might have 8 legs, it could have 3 heads, 7 mouths, we don't know. But you have to make an animation and a system that will accommodate whatever the character is, whatever the player comes up with, the animation has to work.
The fun thing about Will is that the challenges that he presents aren't just the challenges that you've already solved 100 times in other games. They're really weird and new challenges, and coming up with good answers for them is is the essence of creativity.
Spore was a very challenging project because we were trying to innovate in so many dimensions at once. There was a lot of innovative design involved, a lot of, fairly deep technology. Huge challenges in terms of we had all these different genres of gameplay that you go through across the levels, but yet we wanted to have the player to feel like it was the same game. Roughly the way the controls worked and the camera and the interface had to feel fairly consistent across levels, even though we're dealing with things like first-person eaters, like a first-person shooter. RTS, Pac-Man, all these different genres have to feel, basically live under the same control system.
Making sure that the player experienced it as this overall journey, that they were taking their creation from cell to creature, tribe, civ, and ultimately into a spacefaring race. That was a unique challenge because we had come up with different genres.
Getting that aesthetic smoothness that you could normally kind of take for granted when you have complete control over every aspect of the game, and suddenly your player actually has most of the control. It's quite challenging.
So Spore is a world where there's lots of different colors. Of course, the player can decide that they want to have a very colorful creature, or the player can decide they want to have a gray creature. And so you've got kind of open-ended color choices that the player is making at every stage of the game. But all this has to sort of blend together into one coherent world. And so we spent all this time making so that the skies had sort of these beautiful colors that were informed by the color of the sun. So you'd have the sun up there, and then you'd get this glow of sunlight through the atmosphere, and that would tint and diffuse through the land, and so the land would blend into the color of the sky. And then the creatures would all be lit properly by sort of the golden light of sunset, for example, or the bluish light of midnight. And so no matter what choices the player makes in terms of color, we had to make sure that they all integrated cleanly into the color palettes of the worlds.
We knew that basically almost everything in the game wanted to have a procedural or generative basis, so the computer could create animations, planets, models. One of the things that I thought was just kind of out of the realm of possibility for us was having the computer compose the music procedurally on the fly. And that was something about halfway through the project. Brian Eno came on, got involved, and so we actually ended up achieving that as well.
Brian Eno came in about 2 years ago. So when he first arrived, he spent about a week here, would make amazing sounds, and we would sample them and get them playing back, and Will and Brian and I would all sort of just be, hunched over the computer for a while and coming up with ideas.